I never imagined the night celebrating a new year would be the night my world shattered. While the fireworks exploded outside, inside the ballroom of that swanky Manhattan hotel, my husband stood in front of our friends and family, glass raised, declaring his new love, and it wasn't me. My heart broke in front of dozens of stunned faces. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 72 years old. I've lived in the same Upper West Side apartment for 37 years, watching the city change from my fourth-floor window. The sounds of Broadway traffic below used to comfort me. Now they just remind me how small I've become in a world that keeps moving while I stood still. That December evening started like any other. I was ironing my navy blue dress, the one with tiny pearl buttons that Robert once said made my eyes sparkle. The steam rose from the fabric, carrying with it the scent of lavender fabric softener I'd used for decades. My hands moved mechanically across the material, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the cold silence that had grown between us like frost on a winter window. The hotel ballroom was everything I'd expected. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables dressed in gold and white. The scent of expensive perfume mingled with fresh roses. I watched other couples laugh together, their hands intertwined, their eyes meeting across crowded conversations. I couldn't remember the last time Robert had looked at me that way. I adjusted my pearl necklace, the one he'd given me for our 25th anniversary, and tried to smile at familiar faces. Mrs. Henderson from down the hall waved at me from across the room. The Goldsteins nodded politely as they passed our table. Everyone seemed to be having the kind of evening I'd dreamed this would be. When midnight approached, I felt a flutter of hope. Maybe this would be our moment. Maybe the new year would bring back the warmth we'd lost. I reached for Robert's hand under the table, but he pulled away, straightening his tie with the nervous gesture I'd learned to recognize over 4 decades of marriage. Then he stood up. The conversations around us quieted. I thought he was going to make a toast to us, to our marriage, to the new year ahead. Instead, his words cut through me like a blade through silk. "I want to toast my new love," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, "to fresh starts and honest hearts." The champagne flute in his hand caught the light as he raised it toward a table near the back. I followed his gaze and saw her, a woman with auburn hair and a confident smile, maybe 50, wearing a red dress that clung to her in all the places mine no longer did. She lifted her glass back to him, and the gesture felt like a slap across my face. The room erupted in confused murmurs. I felt every eye on me, watching my humiliation unfold in real time. My chest tightened, making it hard to breathe. The pearl necklace suddenly felt like it was choking me. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember making my way to the coat check or walking out into the December night. I just remember the cold air hitting my skin and the sound of my heels clicking against the sidewalk as I walked the 23 blocks home, tears freezing on my cheeks. Back in my apartment, I sat in the darkness, still wearing that navy dress with the pearl buttons. The city lights flickered outside my window like distant stars I could never reach. I stared at our wedding photo on the mantelpiece, the one where we're cutting the cake at the Plaza Hotel. We were so young then, so full of dreams and promises. The scent of his cologne still lingered on the sweater he'd left draped over his chair. It mocked me now, that familiar smell that once meant comfort and home. How long had he been planning this? How long had I been a fool? I want you to understand something. This wasn't the first time I'd felt invisible in my own marriage. It was just the first time it happened in front of 60 people who'd watched me build a life I thought was solid. For 43 years, I'd been the backbone of our family. I gave up everything for them. My career as an art restoration specialist at the Metropolitan Museum was just beginning to flourish when Robert's law practice hit rough waters. Without hesitation, I stepped back from my dreams to support his. "Eleanor, I need you," he'd say during those early struggling years. "The kids need you. We can't afford childcare and office help." I believed him. I believed in us. I managed our household like a military operation: school pickup schedules, doctor appointments, birthday parties, parent-teacher conferences. I handled the family finances, stretching every dollar when the law practice was lean, celebrating quietly when it finally started to prosper. When his mother got sick, I became her caregiver. 3 years of daily visits to her nursing home on the East Side, holding her hand through chemotherapy sessions while Robert buried himself in work. "You're so much better at this than I am," he'd say, as if nurturing was some magical gift I possessed rather than a choice I made every single day. The children learned to come to me for everything: emergency money, relationship advice, career guidance. Even now, at 45 and 43, They still called their mother when life got complicated. "Mom, can you send me $500 for the car repair?" my son David would ask, his voice tight with that particular strain of adult embarrassment. "I'll pay you back when the book advance comes through." The book advance that never seemed to materialize. Just like the promotion my daughter Sarah was always almost getting. Just like the raise Robert kept promising would let me pursue my own interests again. I kept detailed records of every loan, every gift, every expense I covered for them. The numbers added up to tens of thousands over the years. Money that could have been my security, my independence, my ticket to the life I'd postponed indefinitely. But money wasn't the only thing I gave. I gave my silence when Robert came home late smelling like wine and someone else's perfume. I gave my understanding when he stopped talking to me about his cases, his dreams, his frustrations. I gave my patience when family dinners became battlefields of criticism and complaint. "The roast is dry," he'd say, not looking up from his phone. "Sarah's therapist thinks you're too controlling," David would add, as if my attempts to stay connected with my own daughter were character flaws. I swallowed it all. The small cruelties, the casual dismissals, the growing sense that I was becoming a stranger in my own family. I told myself it was temporary. Marriages go through phases, after all. Children grow up and establish boundaries. This was normal, I convinced myself. But normal doesn't include being excluded from family group chats. Normal doesn't include your husband booking vacations without consulting you. Normal doesn't include your own children scheduling visits around your absence. I started noticing these things more clearly about 2 years ago. Small slights that I'd been trained to overlook suddenly felt sharp and intentional. Like when Robert started locking his phone, something he'd never done in 4 decades together. Or when the credit card statement started showing charges at restaurants I'd never been to. On dates I'd been home alone. The loneliness crept in like water through cracks in a foundation. Slow at first, then overwhelming. My 70th birthday fell on a Tuesday in March. I woke up excited, despite myself, imagining flowers or a cake, or at least a phone call from my children. Instead, I found a generic card on the kitchen counter, the kind you buy at a gas station. "Happy birthday," in gold cursive, signed simply Robert, in his illegible doctor's scrawl. David texted around noon, "Happy B-Day, Mom. Crazy busy with deadline, we'll call later." The call never came. Sarah's message arrived 3 days late. "Sorry, forgot it was your birthday. Work has been insane. Love you." I sat in my favorite armchair, the blue velvet one we'd bought together at an antique shop in Brooklyn 30 years ago, and cried quietly into my tea, the kind of crying where you're ashamed of your own tears but can't stop them from falling. When I got pneumonia that October, I thought surely someone would notice. I was in Mount Sinai Hospital for 4 days, weak and struggling to breathe. The nurses kept asking about visitors, their tone getting more gentle each time they had to tell me no one had come. "Your husband must be very busy," one young nurse said kindly, trying to make excuses for him. I didn't have the heart to tell her he knew exactly where I was. I'd left a note on the kitchen table for God's sake. My children both had my location shared on their phones. They simply chose not to come. On the 3rd night, I listened to the rain fall against my hospital window and made a decision that terrified me. I was going to start paying attention, really paying attention, to where my money went, where my husband spent his time, and what my children actually thought of me. The discoveries broke my heart in ways I hadn't thought possible. Going through our joint checking account, I found regular payments to a credit card I'd never seen. When I called the bank, they told me it was tied to Robert's name only, opened just 8 months earlier. The monthly bills were substantial. Expensive dinners, hotel charges, jewelry purchases from Tiffany that had never appeared in our bedroom. Then came the phone. Robert had always been casual about leaving it around the house, face up on counters, charging overnight on his nightstand. But lately, it stayed glued to his side, screen down, always just out of my casual glance. One evening in November while he was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the bed. A text message preview lit up the screen. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow, darling. The usual place?" My hands shook as I picked up the device. The message was from someone named Vanessa. I scrolled up through their conversation, my heart sinking with each exchange. "You make me feel young again," Robert had written just days earlier. "I've never felt this way about anyone," she'd replied. "Eleanor doesn't understand me anymore. She's become so bitter, so demanding." Demanding. The word hit me like a physical blow. I, who had spent decades asking for nothing, was demanding. I screenshot the messages, my fingers trembling, and sent them to my own phone. Then I deleted the evidence from his message log and put the phone back exactly where I'd found it. That night, I lay awake listening to Robert's steady breathing beside me, wondering how long he'd been living this double life, how many friends knew about Vanessa. How many social gatherings had I attended where people pitied the oblivious wife? The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror in our bedroom. Really looked. My hair was silver now, cut in the same sensible bob I'd worn for 15 years. My face showed every one of my 70 years, lined with worry more than laughter. My body had the soft, settled shape of a woman who'd borne 2 children and cooked thousands of family dinners. But my eyes still held fire. And for the first time in years, I felt that fire starting to burn. I spent the next month gathering information like a detective. Bank statements, credit card bills, phone records I could access through our family plan. The picture that emerged was devastating and clear. Robert had been supporting a second life for over a year. Expensive dinners, weekend getaways to the Hamptons, jewelry that sparkled on someone else's fingers. Our retirement savings, money I'd helped build through decades of careful budgeting and sacrifice, was funding his midlife fantasy. But it wasn't just the money, it was the elaborate deception. The fake business trips that were actually romantic weekends. The emergency law meetings that were really dinner dates. The concerned friend who called the house asking about Robert's illness on a day when he'd told me he was working late at the office. I started taking photographs of everything, screenshots of messages, pictures of bills, copies of bank transfers. Evidence of a betrayal so complete it made my chest ache. During this time, I barely ate. I'd sit at our kitchen table surrounded by papers and printouts, trying to make sense of how I'd become so expendable in my own life. The apartment felt different now, less like a home and more like a museum of memories that might have been lies all along. The hardest part was realizing how long I'd been making excuses for him. Every late night, every canceled plan, every moment when he seemed emotionally distant. I'd crafted explanations that allowed me to keep believing in us, even as he was systematically dismantling everything we'd built together. My children's complicity hurt almost as much as Robert's betrayal. When I finally worked up the courage to mention some concerns to Sarah, her response was swift and cutting. "Mom, you're being paranoid. Dad's under a lot of stress at work. Maybe if you were more supportive instead of suspicious, things would be better between you." David was even worse. When I asked him directly if he'd noticed anything different about his father, he laughed. "You mean besides the fact that he seems happier lately? Mom, you've been so negative for the past year. It's exhausting to be around. No wonder Dad's pulling away." Negative. Exhausting. The words my own children used to describe me cut deeper than any confession Robert might have made. I realized then that this wasn't just about an affair. This was about a family that had gradually, systematically decided I was the problem. The common denominator in every conflict, every disappointment, every moment of tension. When had I become the villain in my own family's story? The New Year's party was supposed to be a fresh start. Robert had suggested we attend the Hendersons' annual celebration at the Mandarin Oriental, a tradition we'd skipped the past 2 years. I was surprised by his enthusiasm, hopeful that maybe he wanted to rebuild what we'd lost. I spent hours preparing. A facial at the salon down Columbus Avenue, my hair styled in soft waves instead of the usual practical set. I even bought a new dress, navy blue silk that skimmed my figure in flattering ways. The saleswoman at Bloomingdale's assured me it was elegant and age-appropriate. "Your husband is going to be so proud to have you on his arm," she said as she rang up the purchase. If only she'd known. Getting ready that evening, I felt nervous excitement I hadn't experienced in years. Maybe this was our moment. Maybe Robert had planned something special. A public recommitment to our marriage. Maybe the distance between us had just been him planning a surprise. I put on the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 25th anniversary, the one with the antique clasp that always reminded me of his grandmother's jewelry. My reflection in the bedroom mirror looked hopeful, expectant. I saw traces of the young woman who'd believed in forever. Robert emerged from his dressing room looking handsome in his tailored black tuxedo. At 75, he was still distinguished, his silver hair thick and well cut, his posture straight from years of tennis and careful living. Women had always found him attractive, and age had only added to his appeal. "You look lovely," he said, but the compliment felt automatic, obligatory. "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself." We made small talk in the taxi, commenting on the holiday decorations along Central Park West, the crowds of tourists bundled in winter coats. Normal conversation between two people who'd shared a life but had somehow become strangers. The ballroom was magnificent. The Hendersons had spared no expense. Fresh flowers everywhere, crystal stemware, a jazz quartet playing in the corner. I recognized most of the faces, neighbors and friends we'd known for decades, people who'd attended our children's graduation parties, who'd sent casseroles when Robert's father died, who'd formed the social fabric of our adult lives. I felt a flutter of pride walking in beside Robert. We looked like what we were supposed to be, a successful, established couple celebrating another year together. I caught Mrs. Goldman's approving nod, saw the Bernsteins wave from across the room. The evening proceeded normally at first. Cocktails and conversation, catching up with people we hadn't seen since last year's party. I found myself relaxing, enjoying the familiar rhythms of social interaction I'd missed during my months of isolation and investigation. Then, as midnight approached, Robert stood up. I assumed he was going to make one of his usual gracious toasts. Robert had always been good at public speaking, comfortable addressing rooms full of people. I smiled expectantly, proud of my husband's poise and social grace. "I want to toast my new love," he began. The words hit me like cold water. My smile froze on my face as I tried to process what I'd heard. Surely he meant our renewed commitment to each other. Surely this was leading to a romantic declaration about our marriage. "To fresh starts and honest hearts," he continued, raising his glass toward the back of the room. I followed his gaze and saw her, Vanessa, the woman from the text messages. She was sitting at a table with people I didn't recognize, wearing a red dress that seemed to glow under the party lights. She was beautiful in the way women in their 50s can be when they're confident and desired. Her auburn hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and her smile was radiant as she lifted her champagne flute in response to Robert's toast. The room around me seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of our table, my knuckles white against the gold tablecloth. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as people realized what was happening. The jazz quartet played on, oblivious to the drama unfolding among their audience. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, watching for my reaction. Mrs. Wynne. Henderson's face showed shock and pity. The Goldmans looked away uncomfortably. Younger guests pulled out their phones, no doubt recording the moment for social media posterity. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. The string of pearls around my neck felt like a noose. The careful makeup I'd applied hours earlier suddenly felt like paint on a mask that was cracking in public. Robert sat down as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if he hadn't just announced his infidelity to 60 of our closest friends and neighbors. He reached for his dinner roll and buttered it casually, avoiding my stunned gaze. "Robert," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the resumed conversations around us. He looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not guilt or shame, but relief. The relief of a man who'd finally stopped pretending. "We'll talk later," he said quietly, still not meeting my eyes. But I couldn't sit there another moment. The walls of the beautiful ballroom felt like they were closing in on me. The scent of expensive perfume and fresh flowers became overwhelming, suffocating. I needed air, space, somewhere to process what had just happened to my life. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. Someone at the next table asked if I was all right, but I couldn't form words to answer. I made my way to the coat check, retrieved my wool winter coat with shaking hands, and walked out into the December night. The cold air hit my face like a slap, but it was exactly what I needed. I started walking, not toward home, but just away. My breath formed small clouds in the freezing air, and my tears felt warm against my cheeks before they turned cold. 23 blocks. That's how far I walked before my feet, aching in the dress shoes I'd chosen for dancing, carried me back to my own front door. The doorman, Miguel, who'd worked our building for 15 years, took one look at my face and simply nodded sympathetically as he held the door. "Happy New Year, Mrs. Patterson," he said gently. "Happy New Year, Miguel," I managed to reply. Back in my apartment, I sat in darkness on my living room sofa, still wearing the navy dress that was supposed to mark a new beginning. The city lights twinkled beyond my windows like stars I could no longer reach. Manhattan hummed with New Year's celebration while I sat in silence, processing the end of everything I'd thought was permanent in my life. The wedding photo on my mantelpiece caught the streetlight from outside. 2 young people cutting a 3-tier cake, beaming at each other with such hope and certainty. I remembered that moment clearly. The taste of vanilla and buttercream, the weight of my mother's satin dress, the feeling that I was beginning the most important adventure of my life. Had it all been a lie? Or had something real died slowly over the decades until only obligation and habit remained? I sat there until dawn, watching the city wake up below me. People walking dogs, commuters heading to work, life continuing as if the world hadn't shifted fundamentally on its axis. When sunlight finally streamed through my windows, I was still in that navy dress, still trying to understand how public humiliation could feel both shocking and inevitable at the same time. This is when my real story begins. Not the marriage that had died in front of 60 witnesses, but the life I was about to claim for myself. For 43 years, I had been Eleanor Patterson, Robert's wife, David and Sarah's mother, the woman who managed everyone else's needs and desires while forgetting she had her own. Now, for the first time since I was 29 years old, I was just Eleanor. The question was, who was she? The first thing I did was call in sick to my volunteer position at the museum. I couldn't face questions from well-meaning colleagues who might have heard about the party through Manhattan's surprisingly small social network. Instead, I spent the day methodically going through our apartment, looking at our shared possessions with new eyes. Every item told a story of compromise, of my preferences gradually disappearing in favor of what Robert wanted. The artwork on our walls, chosen for his taste. The furniture, selected for his comfort. Even the kitchen dishes were patterns he'd preferred over my choices. I found myself standing in our walk-in closet, looking at my clothes hanging next to his expensive suits. When had I stopped dressing for myself and started dressing to avoid criticism? When had my wardrobe become nothing but navy, black, and beige? Safe colors that wouldn't draw attention or comment. That evening, Robert came home as if it were any ordinary day. He hung up his coat, loosened his tie, and asked about dinner plans with the casual tone of a husband who hadn't destroyed his marriage 12 hours earlier. "We need to talk," I said from the living room. He appeared in the doorway, still in his work clothes, looking tired and somehow smaller than he had at the party. "Eleanor, about last night. You announced your affair in front of everyone we know," I interrupted. "There's nothing to explain. The only question is what happens now." He sat down across from me, rubbing his forehead in a gesture I'd seen thousands of times over the decades. Usually it made me feel sympathetic, worried about his stress levels. Now it just looked like the behavior of a man who'd been caught and was trying to figure out how to minimize the consequences. "I didn't plan for it to happen that way," he said finally, "but you planned for it to happen." He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you. Vanessa and we want to be together officially. I want a divorce, Eleanor." The words should have hurt more than they did. Instead, I felt a strange sense of clarity, as if a fog I hadn't realized I'd been living in had suddenly lifted. "How long?" I asked. 2 years. His honesty was almost refreshing after so many months of deception. "And the children know?" He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "They've suspected. I think they're relieved, honestly. Things haven't been good between us for a while." "Things have been exactly what you made them," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. That night, I slept in the guest bedroom for the first time in our marriage, lying in the small single bed, surrounded by furniture that had never really been used. I felt something unexpected. Relief. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I made breakfast for one, coffee for one person, toast for one person, orange juice in a single glass. I sat at our kitchen table reading the New York Times without checking to see if Robert needed anything, wanted anything, or had opinions about the news I was reading. When he emerged from our bedroom, dressed for work, he stopped short seeing me calmly eating alone. "Eleanor, we should discuss practical matters. The apartment, finances, how we handle this with David and Sarah. We'll discuss those things when I'm ready to discuss them," I replied, not looking up from the newspaper. I could feel his frustration from across the room. Robert was accustomed to controlling the timing and terms of important conversations. My new calm seemed to unsettle him more than tears or anger would have. "I'm trying to be civilized about this," he said. "Civilized would have been talking to me before you talked to 60 strangers about your new love," I replied. He left for work without another word, and I finished my breakfast in peaceful quiet. That afternoon, I called my daughter. "Sarah, I want you to know that your father and I are getting divorced. He's in love with someone else, and last night he announced it at the Hendersons' New Year party." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Mom," she finally said, her voice small in a way I hadn't heard since she was a child. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I wanted you to hear it from me, rather than from someone else. How are you handling this?" "Better than I expected," I said, and realized it was true. We talked for an hour, the longest conversation Sarah and I had shared in months. For the first time in years, my daughter seemed to see me as a person, rather than just a source of maternal services. Her shock at her father's public announcement seemed genuine, and her concern for my well-being felt real. "Mom, I had no idea things were this bad between you two." "I had no idea either," I admitted. "But now that I do, I'm beginning to understand that bad might not be the right word. Maybe we were just finished, and I was the only one still trying." When I called David, his reaction was different. More reserved, less surprised. "I'm sorry, Mom. I know this must be hard for you. Did you know?" I asked directly. Another long pause. I suspected something. Dad seemed different lately. Happier, I guess. There it was. My son had noticed his father's happiness during the period of my greatest loneliness and hadn't thought to check if I was okay. I understand, I said, though I wasn't sure I did. The next few days passed in a strange suspension. Robert and I moved around each other in our apartment like polite strangers. He slept in our bedroom. I stayed in the guest room. We shared coffee in the mornings and minimal conversation about practical matters. I began to notice things I'd been blind to during the crisis. How much space I had in my days without constantly managing Robert's needs and schedule. How quiet the apartment could be without the underlying tension I'd grown so accustomed to. How little we'd actually been sharing, besides proximity and habit. On the 4th day after the party, I made an appointment with a lawyer. Margaret Chen's office was in a building near Lincoln Center, on the 15th floor with windows that looked out over the city I'd called home for so long. She was a woman about my age, recommended by Mrs. Delgado from down the hall who'd gone through her own difficult divorce 15 years earlier. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her desk, "tell me what's happening in your marriage." I found myself talking for nearly 2 hours, laying out not just the infidelity but the years of gradual diminishment that had preceded it. Margaret took notes in neat handwriting, asking occasional questions that helped me see patterns I hadn't fully recognized. "You say you've been supporting the household financially as well as in all other ways?" she asked. I nodded, explaining how my inheritance from my parents had helped fund the down payment on our apartment, how my careful management of our savings had built our retirement nest egg, how I'd continued to contribute from my part-time work and inherited investments even after stepping back from full-time career ambitions. "And you have documentation of these contributions?" "I have everything," I said, thinking of the meticulous records I'd always kept. Bank statements, investment accounts, the paper trail of every major purchase and financial decision we've made together. Margaret smiled for the first time during our meeting. "Excellent. That will make this much cleaner than most cases I handle." She explained New York's equitable distribution laws, the likely timeline for divorce proceedings, and my rights regarding our shared assets. The conversation was both sobering and empowering. I had more legal protection and financial security than I'd realized. "One more question, Mrs. Patterson. What do you want from this process? Beyond the legal requirements, what would make you feel whole again?" I considered her question seriously. "Respect," I said finally. "I want to be treated as an equal participant in ending what we built together, not as an obstacle to his happiness." "That's reasonable and achievable," she assured me. Walking home from Margaret's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation for my own future. Not the future I'd planned with Robert, but a future that belonged entirely to me. That evening, I did something that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. I called Vanessa. I'd found her number in Robert's phone during my months of detective work. Now, sitting in my quiet apartment with a cup of tea and a certainty I'd never felt before, I dialed. "Hello?" Her voice was warm, confident. "Vanessa, this is Eleanor Patterson, Robert's wife. I think we should meet." The silence that followed was profound. I could hear her breathing, processing the unexpected call. "Mrs. Patterson, Robert said you two were separated." "We are now," I said calmly, "but I think there are things we should discuss directly, without Robert managing both sides of the conversation. Would you be willing to meet me for coffee tomorrow afternoon?" She agreed, probably more from shock than genuine willingness. We arranged to meet at a cafe on the Upper East Side, neutral territory for both of us. That night, I chose my clothes carefully, not the invisible navy and black I'd been hiding in for years, but a burgundy sweater that brought out the color in my cheeks and gray slacks that fit me properly. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who was done disappearing. The cafe was busy with the usual Manhattan mix of business meetings and social catch-ups. I arrived first, choosing a table by the window where I could watch the street life outside. When Vanessa walked in, I recognized her immediately from the party, though she looked smaller somehow without the red dress and party lighting. She was beautiful. There was no denying that. But sitting across from her, I realized she wasn't the enemy I'd built up in my mind. She was just a woman who'd fallen in love with a man who'd presented himself as available. "Thank you for meeting with me," I said as she sat down, her hands clearly nervous around her coffee cup. "I'm not sure what to say," she admitted. "Robert told me your marriage had been over for years, that you were living separate lives already. Robert told you what he needed to tell you so he could have what he wanted," I replied, not unkindly. "The same way he told me what I needed to hear so I'd keep providing what he wanted from me." We talked for an hour and a half. Vanessa was 52, a divorcee with grown children, a successful real estate agent who'd met Robert when he'd helped her with a complicated contract dispute. She'd believed his story about our marriage being a formality maintained for social convenience. "He said you were more like roommates than spouses," she explained, her voice getting smaller as she began to understand the full picture. We were roommates in the end, I agreed, but not because the marriage was already over, because he'd stopped participating in it while I kept trying to save something that was dying. I wasn't angry with Vanessa. How could I be? She'd been as deceived as I had, just in different ways. By the time we finished our coffee, I think we both understood that Robert's capacity for self-deception was impressive and destructive. What happens now? She asked as we prepared to leave. Now you decide if you want to build a relationship with a man who spent 2 years lying to both of us, I said simply. And I build a life that doesn't require anyone else's permission to exist. Walking home, I felt lighter than I had in months. Seeing Vanessa as a real person rather than a symbol of my inadequacy had freed me from some of the anger I'd been carrying. The betrayal was still real. The hurt was still deep, but I was beginning to see it as Robert's failure, rather than mine. That evening, Robert came home to find me packing boxes in our living room. "What are you doing?" he asked, alarm clear in his voice. "I'm separating our belongings," I said, continuing to wrap our wedding china in newspaper. "I assume you'll want to move in with Vanessa once the divorce is finalized, and there's no point in maintaining the fiction that this apartment is our shared home. Eleanor, we don't have to do this hostile way. We can be adults about dividing our assets." I looked up from the box I was packing. "This isn't hostile, Robert. Hostile would have been announcing my decision to 60 people at a party before discussing it with you first." He had no answer for that. Over the next few days, I methodically went through 43 years of accumulated possessions, deciding what belonged to my old life and what I wanted to carry into my new one. I kept the books, returning Robert's business tomes and legal references to shelves he could pack himself. I kept the kitchen items I'd actually chosen, leaving him with the expensive gadgets he'd insisted were necessities but rarely used. Most surprisingly, I kept very few photographs. Looking through albums of family vacations, holidays, celebrations, I realized how many of those pictures showed me serving, organizing, managing, and how few showed me simply enjoying myself. I selected only images where my smile looked genuine, where I appeared to be living rather than facilitating other people's lives. The photo that had sat on our mantelpiece for decades, our wedding portrait, I left for Robert. Let him explain to Vanessa why he'd kept a shrine to our marriage while conducting an affair for 2 years. My children's reactions to news of their parents' divorce unfolded exactly as I'd expected. Sarah called frequently, offering support that felt genuine if somewhat guilty. She admitted she'd sensed problems but hadn't known how serious they'd become. "I should have checked on you more," she said during one of our longer conversations. "I got so caught up in my own problems that I stopped seeing you as a person who might be struggling too." David's response was more distant, more practical. He wanted to know about financial arrangements, about whether the divorce would affect holiday traditions, about logistics rather than emotions. I began to understand that my son had inherited his father's capacity to compartmentalize feelings when they became inconvenient. "Are you sure you want to go through with this, Mom?" he asked during one particularly frank conversation. "Maybe counseling could help you two work through this rough patch." "Your father publicly announced his love for another woman at a New Year's party," I replied. "That's not a rough patch, David. That's a declaration of independence from our marriage." 3 weeks after the party, I signed a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment 6 blocks away. Same neighborhood, same familiar streets, but a space that would belong entirely to me. It had huge windows facing south, filling the rooms with light I hadn't realized I'd been missing in our north-facing place. The kitchen was smaller but designed with more thought for actual cooking rather than impressive entertaining. The day I got the keys, I stood in my new empty living room and felt something I couldn't immediately identify. Then I realized it was possibility. For the first time in decades, I was looking at space that I could fill with my own choices, my own schedule, my own priorities. Moving day was efficiently simple. I'd accumulated surprisingly few possessions I actually cared about during 4 decades of marriage. Books, mostly, and art supplies I'd stored in closets for years, plus practical necessities and a few pieces of furniture that held personal meaning. Robert helped, maintaining the polite distance we'd perfected since that night at the Hendersons' party. We worked together like a well-coordinated team handling a business transaction, which I suppose was what our marriage had become. "The new place looks nice," he said as we finished carrying the last boxes upstairs. "Thank you," I replied. "It feels like home already." That night, I slept in my own bed, in my own apartment, for the first time in 43 years. The silence was different from the tense quiet that had filled my marriage. This was peaceful silence, expectant silence, the silence of a life waiting to be filled with choices I hadn't yet made. I woke up the next morning without an alarm clock, letting my body decide when it was ready to face the day. Sunlight streamed through windows I hadn't thought to cover with curtains yet, and I lay in bed for 20 minutes, just watching the way light moved across my bare walls. When I finally got up, I made coffee for one without feeling lonely. I was beginning to understand the difference between being alone and being lonely, and the realization was liberating. My first weeks of independent living established rhythms I hadn't known I'd wanted. I woke when my body was rested, not when Robert needed the bathroom. I ate what I felt like eating, not what fit within our established meal patterns. I watched television programs that interested me, not background noise for Robert's evening routine. Most importantly, I began to rediscover interests I'd set aside so gradually I'd forgotten I'd ever had them. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, where I'd volunteered for years, became a refuge. During quiet weekday afternoons, I found myself drawn to the American Wings collection of 19th century paintings. Colors and brush strokes that had once been my professional focus now provided purely personal pleasure. One afternoon, studying a landscape by Albert Bierstadt, I overheard a conversation between two visitors struggling to understand the technical details of the painting's composition. Without thinking, I turned to offer some explanation about light source and atmospheric perspective. "Are you a docent?" one of them asked. "No, just someone who used to work with art restoration," I replied. "Would you mind showing us a few more pieces? You explain things so well." I spent the next hour walking through galleries with complete strangers, sharing knowledge I'd thought was no longer useful. By the time we parted ways, I felt more intellectually alive than I had in years. That evening, I called the museum's volunteer coordinator. "Eleanor, how wonderful to hear from you. We've missed you in the textile conservation lab. Actually, I was wondering about docent training. Is it too late for someone my age to start giving tours?" "Too late? Eleanor, you have exactly the background and knowledge we're looking for. Our next training session starts in March. Would you be interested in leading specialized tours about art restoration techniques?" I signed up immediately. Meanwhile, my relationship with Robert evolved into something we'd never quite achieved during our marriage. Honest communication about practical matters without emotional manipulation or hidden agendas. We met for coffee once a week to discuss divorce proceedings, asset division, and the logistics of discontinuing a life we'd built together. These conversations were more productive than most of our marital discussions had been, perhaps because we were finally both telling the truth about what we wanted. "I assume you'll want to keep the apartment," I said during one of these meetings. "Actually, Vanessa and I have been looking at places together, something smaller, more modern. I'd be willing to sell and split the proceeds if you're interested in staying." The offer surprised me. Our apartment held decades of history, but most of those memories now felt complicated rather than precious. My new space was already beginning to feel more like home than the place I'd lived for 37 years. "I think selling is the right choice," I agreed. "Neither of us needs to maintain a shrine to something that didn't work." These practical conversations were healing in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time in our relationship, Robert was treating me as an equal partner in making decisions about our shared assets and responsibilities. The divorce proceedings moved forward with minimal drama. Margaret Chen had been right about the benefits of thorough documentation. Decades of careful record-keeping made asset division straightforward. We divided our investments, sold the apartment, and established separate financial accounts without court intervention. 6 months after that New Year's party, our marriage was legally dissolved. I felt no sadness on the day the papers were finalized, only a sense of completion. Something that had been dying slowly for years was finally, officially over. But this story isn't really about the end of my marriage. It's about what happened after. My new life as a single woman in Manhattan began to take shape in ways I couldn't have imagined. Without the constant background responsibility of managing someone else's needs and moods, I discovered depths of energy and curiosity I'd thought were permanently lost. The docent training at the museum was revelatory. For 12 weeks, I studied art history, museum education techniques, and public speaking skills alongside people from various backgrounds who shared my passion for culture and learning. At 72, I was among the older participants, but not the oldest, and I found myself keeping up easily with readings and assignments that challenged me intellectually. "Eleanor, your insights about the restoration process add such depth to these discussions," our trainer commented after a session about damage assessment in historical paintings. "Have you considered specializing in conservation tours?" I had not, but the suggestion opened possibilities I hadn't considered. My years of professional experience, which I'd assumed were just personal history, had value in contexts I was only beginning to discover. My first official tour as a museum docent was terrifying and exhilarating. Leading a group of 20 visitors through galleries I'd loved for decades, sharing knowledge about artistic techniques and historical context, I felt more intellectually engaged than I had in years. "How do they get such realistic skin tones in these portraits?" a teenage visitor asked, genuinely curious. explaining the layering of glazes and the careful observation of light that created lifelike flesh in Renaissance paintings. I watched her eyes light up with understanding. That moment of connection, sharing knowledge that sparked someone else's curiosity, reminded me why I'd originally fallen in love with art. After the tour, several visitors approached me with additional questions and compliments on my teaching style. Walking home through Central Park that afternoon, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in decades. The satisfaction of doing work that mattered to me, on my own terms. But professional fulfillment was only part of my transformation. Personal relationships, freed from the dynamics of my marriage, began to shift in unexpected ways. My friendship with Mrs. Delgado, my downstairs neighbor, deepened beyond casual hallway conversations. She was a widow of 5 years who'd built a rich, independent life after her husband's death from cancer. We began meeting for coffee on weekends, sharing stories about both the challenges and unexpected freedoms of life without partnerships we'd once thought were permanent. When Carlos died, everyone expected me to be devastated indefinitely, she told me during one of our long conversations. And I was devastated for a while. But I also discovered that I hadn't made a decision entirely for myself in 38 years. That discovery was terrifying and wonderful. Her perspective on widowhood versus divorce was illuminating. We'd both lost marriages, but through different means, and we were both learning to value solitude without loneliness. The difference, she observed, is that you chose your freedom. That makes it easier to embrace. Through Mrs. Delgado, I met other women in our neighborhood who'd navigated significant life transitions in their 60s and 70s. A book club that met monthly in the community room of a nearby building became my introduction to a social circle I'd never known existed. These women, some divorced, some widowed, some never married, had created lives of purpose and pleasure that didn't depend on traditional family structures for meaning. They traveled together, supported each other through health challenges, celebrated personal accomplishments, and shared resources and knowledge about everything from financial planning to dating in later life. Eleanor, one of them said during a discussion about career changes after 60, you should consider teaching. Have you ever thought about adult education programs? I hadn't, but the suggestion took root. My museum work was giving me confidence in my ability to share knowledge effectively, and I was beginning to understand that my professional background might have applications beyond what I'd previously considered. Meanwhile, my relationship with my children continued to evolve as they adjusted to their parents' divorce and my new independence. Sarah visited my new apartment for the first time 3 months after I'd moved in. She walked around the small but bright space, taking in the changes I'd made. "Mom, this place feels so you," she said with some surprise. "I don't think I ever noticed how little of Dad's taste reflected your preferences." "I didn't notice either, until I had space to remember what I actually liked," I replied. We had lunch at the small dining table by my south-facing window, and conversation flowed more easily than it had in years. Without Robert's presence and opinions shaping our interaction, Sarah seemed more interested in my thoughts and feelings as an individual, rather than just her mother. "Are you dating?" she asked, curiosity clear in her voice. "Not yet," I said honestly. "I'm still learning how to be Eleanor alone before I consider being Eleanor with someone else." "That seems wise," she agreed, "though you seem happier than I've seen you in years. More like yourself, if that makes sense." It made perfect sense. I was beginning to feel like myself for the first time in decades. David's adjustment to our family's new configuration was more complex. During our infrequent phone calls, he seemed uncomfortable with discussions about my new life, preferring to keep conversations focused on neutral topics or practical matters. "How's Dad handling the divorce?" he asked during one call, as if I were somehow responsible for monitoring my ex-husband's emotional well-being. "You'll have to ask him that directly," I replied. "I'm not involved in managing his feelings anymore." My response seemed to puzzle him, as if maternal concern were supposed to extend indefinitely toward the father of his children, regardless of our relationship status. I began to see patterns in David's communication that reflected his assumption that my primary identity was still maternal and supportive, available for emotional labor regardless of my own needs or circumstances. Gently but consistently, I started establishing different boundaries in our interactions. "I'm not able to mediate between you and your father anymore," I told him, when he asked me to intervene in a disagreement they were having about holiday plans. "You're both adults who can communicate directly with each other." These new boundaries felt awkward at first, like learning to use my non-dominant hand, but they also felt necessary for my continued development as an individual rather than a family function. 8 months into my new life, I made a decision that surprised even me. I enrolled in a painting class at the Art Students League. I hadn't held a brush for artistic rather than restoration purposes in over 20 years, but something about the structured freedom of creating rather than preserving art appealed to me strongly. The class met on Thursday afternoons in a studio with enormous windows overlooking the city. My classmates ranged in age from college students to retirees, united by curiosity about visual expression rather than professional ambition. "Don't worry about making something beautiful," the instructor told us during the first session. "Focus on making something honest." Working with watercolors for the first time in decades, I found muscle memory I'd thought was permanently lost. The feeling of brush against paper, the unpredictable flow of pigment and water, the meditative focus required for observational drawing, all returned with surprising ease. My early attempts were tentative, cautious, but gradually, as weeks passed, I began to trust my hand and eye more completely. Colors became bolder, compositions more confident. "You have excellent instincts for color relationships," my instructor commented after examining a landscape I'd painted from memory of a weekend visit to the botanical garden. "Have you painted before?" "Many years ago," I replied. "I'm trying to remember what I used to know." "You're not just remembering," she said. "You're developing new capabilities. This work has a maturity that could only come from someone who's lived extensively." Her words stayed with me long after class ended. Lived extensively. I was beginning to understand the value of all those years I'd thought were somehow lost or wasted. That painting, the botanical garden landscape with its soft greens and afternoon light, became the first piece I framed and hung in my own apartment. Looking at it each morning over coffee, I saw proof that I was still capable of growth, still capable of creating something that hadn't existed before my hands brought it into being. A year after my divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected phone call. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Rebecca Williams from the new school. I understand you have extensive experience in art restoration and have been doing educational work at the Metropolitan Museum." I confirmed that was accurate, curious about where the conversation might lead. "We're developing a new continuing education program about art history and preservation for adult learners. Would you be interested in teaching a course on restoration techniques and art historical context?" Teaching. At 73 years old, I was being invited to become a college instructor. "I'd be very interested," I heard myself say. "Can you tell me more about what the position would involve?" The course would meet one evening per week for 12 weeks each semester, designed for adult students who were interested in art, but not necessarily working toward degrees. The curriculum would combine technical information about art conservation with broader discussions of how historical and cultural context affects both the creation and preservation of artistic works. "We're looking for someone who can make these topics accessible to curious adults without previous specialized knowledge," Rebecca explained. "Your combination of technical expertise and educational experience makes you an ideal candidate." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment processing the unexpected opportunity. Teaching had never been part of my plans, either in my original career or in my post-divorce reinvention. But the prospect excited me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I spent the weekend developing a preliminary syllabus, combining technical demonstrations with case studies of famous restoration projects and broader discussions about the ethics of art preservation. By Monday morning, I was eager to schedule an interview. The new school campus buzzed with energy I'd forgotten existed in academic settings. Students of all ages moved through halls and common areas with purpose and curiosity. The continuing education building specifically served adult learners returning to formal learning after years focused on career and family responsibilities. "We love working with instructors who bring real-world experience to their teaching," Rebecca said as she showed me around the facilities. "Our students respond well to faculty who can connect theoretical knowledge with practical application." The classroom I'd be assigned was small but well lit, with projection capabilities for slides and workspace for hands-on demonstration. I could envision myself there, sharing knowledge I'd accumulated over decades, with people who chose to spend their evenings learning about something they found personally meaningful. "When would classes begin?" I asked. "The spring semester starts in February. We'd want to confirm your appointment by December to allow time for course registration and materials preparation." I accepted the position immediately. That evening, I called Sarah to share the news. "Mom, that's incredible!" Her enthusiasm was genuine and warming. "I'm so proud of you for taking on something completely new." "It doesn't feel completely new," I reflected. "More like I'm finally using parts of myself that have been dormant for a long time." "That's even better," she said. "You sound so confident lately, so purposeful." "It's wonderful to hear." David's reaction was more reserved but still supportive. "That sounds like a good opportunity, Mom. Are you sure you're ready for the time commitment?" "I have nothing but time these days," I replied. "The question is whether I'm ready for the intellectual commitment, and I think I am." As fall turned to winter, I prepared for my new role as a college instructor while continuing my museum work and painting classes. For the first time in years, I felt intellectually challenged and personally fulfilled simultaneously. The course materials I developed drew on decades of professional experience, but also incorporated insights from my recent docent training and adult education research. I designed practical exercises that would give students hands-on understanding of conservation challenges, combined with discussions about how political, economic, and cultural factors influence both art creation and preservation decisions. Restoration is never purely technical, I wrote in my course introduction. Every choice we make about preserving art reflects values about what stories deserve to survive and who has the authority to make those decisions. My first class meeting in February was nerve-wracking in the best possible way. 15 adult students, ranging in age from their 30s to their 70s, gathered around tables in our assigned classroom. Some had art backgrounds. Others were simply curious about museum practices and art history. "I'm Eleanor Patterson," I began, "and I've spent the last 45 years thinking about how we preserve beautiful things for future generations. Tonight, we're going to start exploring why that matters and how it's done." For the next 2.5 hours, we discussed everything from the chemistry of paint degradation to the ethics of removing later additions from original artworks. Students asked thoughtful questions that challenged me to explain complex concepts clearly and consider perspectives I hadn't fully examined. Walking home after that first class, I felt energized in a way that was entirely new. The intellectual stimulation of teaching, combined with the satisfaction of sharing knowledge that mattered to me, created a sense of professional purpose I'd never experienced before. My students came from various backgrounds: a retired lawyer interested in art collecting, a working mother who'd always wanted to understand museum practices, a young professional looking to change careers, a couple planning extended travels who wanted deeper appreciation for the art they'd encounter. Each week, their questions and insights pushed me to articulate ideas I'd been carrying unconsciously for years. Teaching, I discovered, was also learning about my own knowledge, about effective communication, about the joy of intellectual community. "Professor Patterson," one student said after a particularly engaged discussion about controversial restoration decisions, "you make these dilemmas so real. I never thought about how subjective preservation choices could be." "That's exactly what I hoped you'd understand," I replied. "Art conservation isn't just about techniques, it's about values." By mid-semester, I was completely comfortable in the classroom and genuinely excited about each week's discussions. My students seemed equally engaged, arriving early for class and staying late for continued conversations about topics that connected to their personal interests and experiences. The semester's highlight was a field trip to the Metropolitan Museum's conservation labs, where my former colleagues demonstrated actual restoration work in progress. Seeing my students observe firsthand the processes we'd discussed in class, asking intelligent questions born of their developing knowledge base, I felt proud of what we'd accomplished together. "This has been transformative," one student told me during our final class. "I look at art completely differently now, and I understand what museums do in ways I never considered before." "You've changed how I think about teaching, too," I replied honestly. "Thank you for being such thoughtful participants in this process." That night, walking home through familiar neighborhood streets, I reflected on how much my life had changed in just 2 years. From a woman whose primary identity was managing other people's needs to someone whose days were filled with intellectual challenge, creative expression, and meaningful relationships I'd chosen independently. The financial aspects of my new life had stabilized as well. My divorce settlement, combined with my part-time teaching income and modest museum stipend, provided security without luxury. More importantly, I felt confident about my ability to support myself through work that mattered to me personally. My small apartment had evolved into a true home filled with art I'd created, books I'd chosen, furniture that reflected my preferences. Friends visited regularly: Mrs. Delgado and women from book club, former museum colleagues, even some of my adult students who'd become friends beyond our academic relationship. But perhaps the most significant change was internal. I'd learned to value my own company, to make decisions based on my preferences rather than other people's expectations, to see myself as someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered independently of their utility to family members. One evening in late May, as I prepared for summer break from teaching and planned a weekend painting retreat in Hudson Valley, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt lonely. Alone frequently, by choice and with pleasure, but not lonely. My phone rang as I was reviewing art supply lists for the retreat. "Eleanor, it's Robert." I hadn't spoken with my ex-husband in several months, not since our final divorce paperwork had been completed. His voice on the phone sounded strained, uncertain. "Hello, Robert. Is everything all right? I wondered if we could meet for coffee sometime soon. There are some things I'd like to discuss with you. His request surprised me. Under no obligation to maintain any relationship with him beyond legal necessities, I'd assumed our communication had ended permanently. What sorts of things? I asked. Personal things. About mistakes I made, about our marriage, about how things ended between us. I considered his request carefully. My initial instinct was polite refusal. I'd moved on from our relationship completely and felt no need to revisit past grievances. But curiosity won over caution. All right, I said finally. Coffee would be fine. Next week sometime? We arranged to meet at a cafe near Lincoln Center, neutral territory that had never been part of our shared routines. Preparing for this meeting, I realized how much my perspective on our marriage had shifted over the past 2 years. Anger had faded into something more like analytical understanding. I could see patterns clearly now that had been invisible while I was living within them. Robert looked older when he arrived at the cafe. His hair whiter, his face showing strain I hadn't noticed during our divorce proceedings. He seemed nervous in a way that was entirely unfamiliar. Throughout our marriage, he'd always projected confidence regardless of circumstances. Thank you for agreeing to see me, he began after we'd ordered coffee. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure I would either, I replied honestly. What did you want to discuss? He was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. I want to apologize for how I handled our divorce. The New Year's party, specifically. That was cruel and unnecessary, and you didn't deserve that kind of public humiliation. His words were unexpected. During our marriage, Robert had rarely apologized for anything, and certainly never acknowledged causing me emotional pain. Thank you, I said simply. That was cruel. I appreciate you acknowledging it. I also want you to know that I've been thinking about our marriage differently lately, about my part in what went wrong between us. What have you been thinking? I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. I think I stopped seeing you as a complete person somewhere along the way. I started thinking of you as someone whose job was to support my goals and manage our family life, rather than someone with your own ambitions and needs. This level of self-awareness was so unlike the Robert I'd been married to that I wondered what had prompted it. What made you realize that? I asked. He smiled ruefully. Vanessa, actually. She's made it very clear that she expects to be treated as an equal partner in our relationship. When I started reverting to patterns from our marriage, expecting her to manage social obligations, assuming my work took priority over hers, she called me on it immediately. I see. I was beginning to understand the purpose of his confession. She's right to insist on those boundaries, he continued. But it made me realize how much I'd taken your accommodation for granted, how unfairly I'd treated your needs as secondary to mine. For 43 years, I added. For 43 years, he confirmed. I'm sorry, Eleanor. You deserved better from me and from our marriage. His apology was sincere, I believed, but it also felt academic, like a thoughtful analysis of historical events rather than an emotional reckoning with ongoing consequences. I accept your apology, Robert, I said after considering my response. I appreciate you taking responsibility for patterns that were hurtful to me. How are you doing? He asked then, seeming genuinely interested in my answer. You look good. Different, but good. I thought about how to summarize the transformation of my life since our divorce. I'm doing very well, I said finally. Better than I expected, actually. I'm teaching now, at the new school. Art history and conservation courses for adult students. Teaching? He couldn't hide his surprise. Eleanor, that's wonderful. You always were excellent at explaining complex ideas. I'd forgotten that about myself, I admitted. I'd forgotten a lot of things about myself. We talked for another 30 minutes about neutral topics. His work, my museum activities, our children's recent news. The conversation was pleasant, but felt like interaction between friendly acquaintances rather than people who'd shared 4 decades of intimate life. As we prepared to leave, Robert hesitated as if he wanted to say something more. What is it? I asked. I hope you find someone who appreciates you properly, he said quietly. You're an extraordinary woman, Eleanor. I wish I'd been smart enough to understand that while I still had the chance to act on it. His words were kind, but they also revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had characterized our entire relationship. He still saw my worth in terms of how a romantic partner might value me, rather than recognizing that I'd learned to value myself independently. Thank you, Robert, I replied. I hope you and Vanessa build something that makes you both happy. Walking home from that meeting, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. Robert's apology didn't change the past, but it confirmed that my perception of our marriage's problems had been accurate. More importantly, his visit highlighted how much I'd changed from the woman who would have felt responsible for reassuring him about his guilt and managing his emotional discomfort. Summer brought new adventures I'd planned entirely for my own pleasure. The painting retreat in Hudson Valley was my first solo travel experience in decades that wasn't designed around family obligations or Robert's preferences. The retreat was held at a converted barn on a working farm, with accommodations for 12 participants and instruction from professional artists who emphasized personal expression over technical perfection. My fellow participants were mostly women, ranging in age from their 40s to their 80s, united by interest in serious creative exploration. For 5 days, I painted landscapes, still life arrangements, and abstract color studies without any external pressure or schedule constraints. The luxury of uninterrupted creative time, combined with beautiful rural scenery and stimulating conversations with interesting women, felt like a gift I'd given myself. "Your work has such emotional depth," one of the instructors commented while reviewing my week's output. "You paint like someone who has something important to say." "I'm still discovering what that might be," I replied, studying a painting I'd done of late afternoon light filtering through apple trees. "That's the best reason to keep painting," she said. "Art helps us understand what we're thinking and feeling before we can put it into words." I returned to Manhattan with a portfolio of work I was genuinely proud of and a renewed commitment to regular creative practice. More importantly, I returned with increased confidence in my ability to find fulfillment through activities I chose independently. Fall semester brought new students and expanded course offerings. The new school asked me to develop an advanced seminar on controversial restoration case studies, designed for students who'd completed my introductory course or had substantial art historical background. "Your students consistently rate your courses among the most engaging in our program," the department coordinator told me. "Would you be interested in teaching additional sections?" I agreed to take on a second class, bringing my teaching schedule to 6 hours per week plus preparation time. Combined with continued museum work and painting classes, my weekly schedule felt full but never overwhelming. At 74, I was busier and more intellectually stimulated than I'd been during most of my marriage, yet I also felt more relaxed, more present in my daily experiences. The difference I realized was that all my activities served my interests and goals, rather than maintaining systems that supported other people's priorities. October brought an unexpected reunion when Sarah visited New York for a work conference. She stayed with me in my small apartment, our first extended time alone together since my divorce. "Mom," she said on her second morning, watching me organize materials for an upcoming class, "I have to tell you something I've been thinking about for months." "What's that?" I asked, looking up from my handouts and slide notes. "I owe you an enormous apology. For years, really. But especially for how I reacted when you and Dad were having problems. I dismissed your concerns, made you feel like you were being dramatic or paranoid, and generally treated you like your feelings didn't matter as much as Dad's comfort." Her words surprised me with their directness and emotional maturity. "I was scared," she continued. "Scared of family instability. Scared of having to take sides. Scared of admitting that our family had serious problems. So I blamed you for noticing the problems rather than supporting you in addressing them." "Oh, Sarah." I sat down across from her at my small kitchen table. "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know. Watching how you've rebuilt your life since the divorce, seeing how confident and purposeful you've become, I realize how much you were diminished during those last years of your marriage, and I contributed to that diminishment by not taking your emotional needs seriously." We spent the rest of her visit having conversations we'd never managed while she was growing up or during the complicated years of my marriage's decline. For the first time, Sarah seemed to see me clearly as an individual with my own history, struggles, and accomplishments. "I'm proud of you," she said the morning she flew back to Chicago. "Not just for surviving the divorce, but for figuring out who you are beyond being someone's wife and mother." "I'm still figuring that out," I admitted, "but I'm enjoying the process." That conversation with Sarah represented something I'd hoped for but hadn't expected. Recognition from my children that I existed as a person beyond my family role. It wouldn't undo years of being taken for granted, but it suggested that future relationships with my adult children might be based on mutual respect rather than one-sided service. David's evolution was slower and more complicated. During occasional phone calls, he still seemed most comfortable discussing practical matters, my health, financial situation, holiday plans, rather than the emotional realities of my transformed life. But gradually, even he began to acknowledge changes in me that he couldn't entirely ignore. "You sound different, Mom," he said during a Thanksgiving phone call. "More confident, I guess." "I feel different," I replied. "Doing work that matters to me. Living space that's entirely my own. It's changed how I think about myself." "Are you lonely?" he asked, the question probably reflecting his own fears about family dissolution. "Sometimes, but not often. I'm alone a lot by choice. but I've learned there's a difference between solitude and loneliness. Spring of my third year post-divorce brought an opportunity that challenged everything I thought I understood about my capabilities and interests. Eleanor, Rebecca from the new school called on a Tuesday evening. We've received an interesting proposal that I'd like to discuss with you. She explained that the American Federation of Arts was developing a traveling education program for small museums and community organizations. They needed experienced educators who could deliver high-quality art historical programming to institutions that couldn't afford permanent education staff. The position would involve travel, probably 20 to 30 weekends per year, to locations throughout the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions. You'd be developing and delivering specialized workshops on art conservation, presenting lectures, and training local volunteers to continue educational programming. Travel for work, at 74, to places I'd never been, working with institutions and communities I'd never encountered. 6 months earlier, the prospect would have seemed impossible, even terrifying. Tell me more about the travel requirements, I said, surprising myself with my interest rather than immediate dismissal. The program provided complete logistical support, transportation, accommodations, materials, and administrative assistance. Participating educators worked with small museums, historical societies, and community art centers that served populations without access to major cultural institutions. You'd be bringing expertise and resources to communities that rarely have these opportunities, Rebecca explained. The impact could be substantial, both for the institutions you'd work with and for the audiences you'd reach. I asked for time to consider the opportunity, but even as we spoke, I felt excitement building about the prospect of expanded influence and usefulness for knowledge I'd accumulated over decades. That weekend, I walked through Central Park thinking about the decision. Travel had been one of the compromises I'd made during my marriage. Robert preferred familiar destinations and predictable schedules, so I'd given up dreams of exploration and adventure. Now, at an age when most people were reducing their commitments, I was being offered the chance to take my work beyond familiar boundaries and see whether knowledge could translate effectively across different communities and contexts. By Monday, I'd made my decision. I'm interested, I told Rebecca. When would the program begin? June, with a summer training institute for participating educators. Your first assignments would begin in September. I accepted the position immediately. The Summer Training Institute was held at a conference center in the Berkshire Mountains, bringing together 12 educators from various backgrounds who would constitute the program's inaugural cohort. We spent 2 weeks learning about community engagement strategies, developing adaptable curriculum frameworks, and practicing presentation techniques for diverse audiences. My fellow educators included museum professionals, university professors, and independent scholars, all united by commitment to making art education accessible beyond traditional institutional boundaries. The collaborative environment reminded me again how much I'd missed intellectual community during the years I'd focused exclusively on family obligations. Eleanor, your practical restoration experience gives you credibility that will be invaluable in community settings, our program director commented after I'd presented a workshop demonstration on paint analysis techniques. Community audiences respond well to educators who can show them real processes rather than just talking about abstract concepts. September brought my first assignment, a weekend workshop at a small historical society in a rural town in Massachusetts. The organization served a community of fewer than 5,000 people, with a tiny budget and a collection of locally significant artworks that hadn't been professionally assessed in decades. I drove my rented car through New England landscapes I'd never seen, staying overnight in a bed and breakfast run by a retired couple who'd moved from Boston seeking simpler life rhythms. The experience felt like adventure in ways I hadn't experienced since I was young. The Historical Society was housed in a converted 19th century mansion, with period rooms and display cases filled with paintings, furniture, and decorative objects donated by local families over many years. My workshop participants included volunteers, local teachers, and community members interested in learning basic conservation techniques for protecting their collection. We know some of these pieces are valuable, the Society's volunteer director explained, but we don't have resources for professional assessment or conservation. We're hoping you can teach us how to care for what we have more effectively. For 2 days, I worked with 15 dedicated volunteers, teaching them how to assess condition problems, implement preventive conservation measures, and identify pieces that required professional intervention. We examined paintings with magnifying glasses, discussed proper storage techniques, and practiced gentle cleaning methods on appropriate objects. I never realized how much we could do ourselves to protect these artworks, one participant said as we concluded the weekend. This knowledge makes me feel much more confident about our stewardship responsibilities. Driving home through October mountain scenery, I reflected on how satisfying the experience had been. My knowledge had translated effectively to a completely different context, and I'd connected with people whose dedication to preserving their community's cultural heritage was inspiring. Over the following months, I traveled to similar institutions throughout the region, small museums in former industrial towns, community art centers in rural areas, historical societies preserving local heritage in places that rarely appeared in travel guides. Each assignment brought new challenges and rewards. Working with different audiences, from elderly volunteers to middle school students, stretched my teaching abilities in ways classroom instruction never had. I learned to adapt technical concepts for non-specialist audiences while maintaining accuracy and depth. More importantly, I began to understand that knowledge becomes most powerful when it's shared beyond academic or professional boundaries. My decades of restoration experience had value I'd never fully appreciated, not just for preserving individual artworks, but for empowering communities to protect their own cultural resources. By spring, I was teaching at the new school 2 evenings per week and traveling for community workshops 2 or 3 weekends per month. My schedule was fuller than it had been during any period of my adult life, yet I felt more energized than I had in decades. The combination of intellectual challenge, meaningful work, and regular travel to places I'd never visited created a sense of possibility and adventure that contrasted starkly with the predictable routines of my married life. "You're glowing," Mrs. Delgado observed during one of our regular coffee dates. "Whatever you're doing agrees with you completely." "I think I've found my calling," I replied, about 50 years later than expected. Summer brought another milestone, my 75th birthday. Instead of the quiet, overlooked occasions of recent years, I decided to celebrate with intentionality and joy. I planned a small dinner party in my apartment, inviting friends I'd made since my divorce, women from book club, colleagues from the museum, students who'd become friends, neighbors who'd supported me through difficult transitions. Preparing for the party, I realized how much my social life had expanded and deepened since I'd stopped centering it around Robert's preferences and our couple friends who'd largely disappeared during the divorce. To Eleanor, Mrs. Delgado offered a toast as we gathered around my dining table, who shows us that life's most exciting chapters can begin when we think the story might be ending. To second acts, added Margaret, one of my former students, and the courage to write them ourselves. Looking around the table at women who'd become genuine friends through shared interests rather than social obligation, I felt gratitude for the unexpected community that had formed around my independent life. At 75, I was more professionally accomplished, more socially connected, and more personally fulfilled than I'd been at 55. The losses that had seemed devastating 3 years earlier, marriage, family centrality, financial security tied to Robert's career, had created space for discoveries I couldn't have imagined while those structures remained intact. But this story isn't finished yet. If anything, it feels like it's still beginning. Last month, I received a letter that opened possibilities I hadn't considered. A small college in Vermont, known for innovative programs serving adult learners, invited me to apply for a visiting professor position. The role would involve developing a new interdisciplinary program combining art conservation with community heritage preservation, exactly the intersection of interests my freelance work had helped me discover. "We're looking for someone who can bridge theoretical knowledge with practical community applications," the department chair wrote. "Your combination of professional experience and community education work makes you uniquely qualified for what we're trying to create." The position would begin next fall and involve relocating to Vermont for academic year residencies, with summers free for continued community workshop travel. At 75, I would become a college professor with my own program to design and implement. 6 months ago, the prospect would have seemed impossible. Now, it feels like the next logical step in a life I'm finally living on my own terms. I haven't made a final decision yet, but I'm strongly considering it. The thought of living in a completely new place, surrounded by mountains instead of city streets, working with college students as well as adult learners, excites me in ways that feel both surprising and completely natural. If I accept the position, I'll be starting over again at an age when most people are winding down. But starting over has already proven to be one of my greatest strengths. This morning, sitting in my sunny apartment with coffee and newspapers spread on my small dining table, I looked out at Manhattan streets I've walked for decades and thought about how much has changed since that devastating New Year's Eve 3 years ago. The woman who stood humiliated in that hotel ballroom, watching her husband toast his new love, feels like someone I knew long ago rather than someone I was. She was smaller, quieter, more afraid. She believed her value came from service to other people, and that leaving her marriage would mean choosing loneliness over connection. She was wrong about almost everything, but I don't feel angry with her anymore. She was doing the best she could with the understanding she had at the time. And her willingness to finally say enough created space for everything that followed. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There were months of fear, uncertainty, and grief for the life I'd thought was permanent. There were moments when I questioned whether I'd made the right choices, whether independence was worth the loss of familiar structures, even dysfunctional ones. But gradually, day by day, I discovered capabilities I'd forgotten I had, and interests I'd abandoned so long ago I'd stopped missing them. More importantly, I learned that being alone and being lonely were entirely different experiences, and that solitude chosen freely could be nurturing rather than isolating. My relationship with my children has changed fundamentally. Instead of managing their needs and emotions, I've learned to be present with them as an individual with my own boundaries and interests. The shift was difficult initially. They'd grown accustomed to having a mother who existed primarily to serve their family's functional requirements. Now they have a mother who is also a person with her own life. Sarah has adapted well to this change, even commenting that she respects me more now that I advocate for myself, rather than silently accommodating everyone else's preferences. Our conversations have depth and mutuality they never had when I was just responding to her needs. David is still adjusting, but he's beginning to ask about my work and travels with what seems like genuine interest. During our most recent call, he said something that surprised me. "Mom, I'm proud of how you've handled everything since the divorce. You're stronger than I realized. Maybe I am, or maybe I'm exactly as strong as I always was, but finally in circumstances that allow that strength to be visible rather than spent on maintaining other people's comfort. My financial situation has stabilized in ways I couldn't have predicted. Teaching and consulting income, combined with my divorce settlement and careful management of personal resources, provide security that doesn't depend on anyone else's career decisions or goodwill. For the first time in my adult life, I control my own economic circumstances completely. The independence is both practical and psychological. I make decisions about spending, saving, and risk-based entirely on my own priorities. If I want to take an expensive painting workshop, I don't need anyone's permission or approval. If I decide to turn down work because it doesn't interest me, I don't have to justify the financial impact to someone whose goals might conflict with mine. Robert and I have settled into cordial distance. We exchange holiday cards and occasional brief updates about our children, but we're no longer part of each other's daily reality. I learned through Sarah that his relationship with Vanessa is stable, and I'm genuinely glad he found someone who can appreciate what he has to offer. Our marriage wasn't entirely bad. We raised 2 successful children together, supported each other through various challenges, and shared some genuine happiness during earlier years. But it had run its course decades before we officially ended it. And my attempts to resuscitate something that was essentially dead had been exhausting for both of us. Sometimes I wonder what might have been different if I'd advocated for myself earlier, established boundaries, insisted on being treated as an equal partner long before crisis forced the issue. But I don't spend much time on such speculation. The past led me to where I am now, and I wouldn't trade my current life for any alternative I can imagine. My days now have rhythm and purpose that feel entirely authentic. I wake without alarm clocks, letting my body determine its natural sleep patterns. I eat what appeals to me, read books that interest me, plan activities that feed my curiosity and creativity. Teaching gives me intellectual stimulation and sense of contributing something meaningful to other people's development. Travel introduces me to places and communities I never would have encountered otherwise. Painting provides creative expression that belongs entirely to me. Most importantly, I've learned to enjoy my own company in ways I never did during decades focused primarily on maintaining relationships with other people. Solitary evenings reading in my comfortable chair, Saturday mornings painting in natural light, long walks through museum galleries where no one knows my name. These experiences feel relaxing and restoring rather than empty or lonely. I still value relationship and community, but from a position of choice rather than need. The friendships I've developed since my divorce are based on mutual interest and respect, rather than social obligation or family connection. When I spend time with people, it's because I want to be with them, not because I'm trying to avoid being alone. This shift in perspective has been one of the most profound aspects of my transformation. Learning to be content with my own company created foundation for healthier connections with others. When I'm not afraid of solitude, I don't have to compromise my boundaries or authentic self to maintain relationships that aren't mutually satisfying. Looking toward the future, I see possibilities rather than limitations. The Vermont teaching opportunity represents one potential direction, but not the only one. I could expand my community workshop program, write about art conservation for general audiences, travel to places I've always wanted to see, or pursue interests I haven't even discovered yet. At 75, I feel like I'm just beginning to understand what I'm capable of accomplishing when I'm not constrained by other people's expectations or my own fears about disappointing them. The woman who was publicly humiliated at that New Year's party thought her story was ending. In reality, it was finally beginning. Last week, I was walking through Central Park after teaching an evening class when I passed a group of elderly women sitting on benches near the reservoir. They were deep in animated conversation, laughing frequently, clearly enjoying each other's company on a lovely spring evening. One of them looked up as I passed and smiled at me with the kind of recognition that occurs between women who've learned to create lives of independence and purpose. I smiled back, and for a moment, we had a connection that required no words. That's when I understood something important about my journey. I hadn't just escaped a marriage that wasn't serving me. I'd joined a community of women who've learned that life's most satisfying chapters sometimes begin when we're no longer young, no longer primarily defined by our relationships to other people, no longer willing to make ourselves smaller to accommodate others' limitations. This community is invisible most of the time, but it's everywhere. Women traveling alone to places they've always wanted to see. Women starting new careers or creative practices in their 60s and 70s. Women learning skills they'd abandoned decades earlier for family responsibilities. Women choosing solitude over unfulfilling relationships. Adventure over security. Personal growth over social approval. We're rewriting the narrative about women's later lives, proving that neither aging nor the end of traditional family structures means the end of possibility, passion, or purpose. 3 years ago, if someone had told me I'd be traveling regularly for work I loved, teaching college courses, planning potential relocation to Vermont, and feeling more optimistic about the future than I had in decades, I wouldn't have believed them. But here I am, and here you are, listening to this story. Maybe some of what I've shared feels familiar to you. Maybe you've also found yourself gradually becoming invisible in your own life, accommodating other people's needs while your own dreams get smaller and quieter. Maybe you've wondered what might be possible if you had the courage to choose yourself first for once. I can't tell you what your transformation might look like. Everyone's circumstances and possibilities are different. But I can tell you that it's never too late to start asking what you want, what you need, what you might accomplish if you stopped seeking other people's permission to exist fully. The hardest part is beginning, taking the first step toward honoring your own preferences instead of managing everyone else's. Setting boundaries that protect your time and energy. Saying no to requests that drain you without offering anything meaningful in return. But once you begin to remember who you are beyond your family roles and social obligations, once you start making decisions based on your own values and interests, the transformation becomes self-reinforcing. Each choice you make for yourself creates space for the next one. It doesn't happen overnight. It requires patience with yourself as you relearn skills and interests you may have set aside for decades. It requires courage to disappoint people who prefer you in supporting roles. It requires faith that your own happiness and fulfillment matter as much as everyone else's. But it's possible. At any age, under almost any circumstances, it's possible to begin again. My story started with public humiliation and private devastation. It continues with work that energizes me, relationships that nourish me, and possibilities that excite me. It might end with a new career in Vermont, or adventures I can't yet imagine, or simply the quiet satisfaction of days lived authentically and purposefully. What matters isn't where the story ends, but that it belongs entirely to me now. Have you ever lived or known someone who lived something like this? Have you ever felt like you were disappearing in your own life, becoming smaller and quieter to make room for other people's demands and expectations? Please share your stories in the comments. Tell me about moments when you chose yourself, when you said no to requests that diminished you, when you began to remember dreams you'd set aside for other people's comfort. Like this video and subscribe if my story resonated with you. These conversations matter. They help all of us remember that transformation is possible, that our stories don't end when our traditional roles change, that the most interesting chapters of our lives might be the ones we write entirely for ourselves. Let's keep opening our hearts together, supporting each other through the courage it takes to claim the lives we actually want to live.